Hey there. Tonight, I want to take you deep into one of the strangest, most haunting episodes of World War II. A story that begins with a shadowy flight across enemy skies and ends with a broken man locked away in silence. Imagine a top Nazi official parachuting down onto a lonely Scottish field, his true identity hidden, his purpose a complete mystery. And by the end of this chapter, you'll hear a theory so wild, so unexpected, it might just make you question everything you thought you knew about high-level secrets during wartime. If you're drawn to unsolved mysteries, forgotten corners of history, and the kinds of stories that keep you wondering long after the lights go out, go ahead and like and subscribe, but only if you're genuinely enjoying this journey. While you're settling in, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is on your clock. Let's see how many night owls and history buffs we've got from around the globe. Now, dim those lights, get comfortable, and let's set off on this calming yet suspenseful journey into the heart of the Rudolf Hess mystery. Picture this. It's May 1941, and the world is locked in the chaos of the war in Europe. Germany's grip seems unbreakable, and at Adolf Hitler's side stands Rudolf Hess, the so-called Deputy Führer. He's not just another face in the crowd. At this moment, Hess is officially the second most powerful man in the entire Nazi hierarchy, trusted with the regime's secrets and ambitions. But on the evening of May 10th, everything changes. Under a veil of secrecy so thick that even his closest colleagues have no clue, Hess sets out on a mission that defies logic and reason. He climbs into a twin-engine Messerschmitt, the kind of aircraft built for speed and stealth, and lifts off from an airfield near Munich. It's just past 6 p.m. when Hess steers northwest, flying low along the Rhine River, then swinging out over the vast cold waters of the North Sea. His destination? Not Berlin, not Paris, but Scotland. A place so unlikely for a Nazi leader that even now, historians shake their heads in disbelief. He's alone in the cockpit, navigating only by maps and memory, dodging British radar and anti-aircraft defenses for nearly 1,000 miles. As darkness thickens, the Messerschmitt hums over the North Sea, pressed onward by the frantic hope of a man with a secret. Just after 10:30 p.m., Hess finally spots the rolling green hills of southern Scotland. But his fuel is almost gone, the engine sputtering as the land rushes up to meet him. Desperation sets in. He's still a few miles short of where he hopes to land, so there's only one option left. He bails out. Parachuting into the cold, damp Scottish night, Hess thuds down in a farmer's field near the village of Eaglesham. He lands hard, spraining his ankle, but he's alive and, for the moment, undetected. But not for long. A local Scottish farmer, probably expecting nothing more exciting than a stray sheep, stumbles across the wreckage of the burning Messerschmitt and its mysterious pilot. The air smells of scorched metal and oil, and the pilot, dazed and limping, identifies himself as Captain Alfred Horn. Suspicious but quick thinking, the farmer alerts the local home guard, and soon enough, British authorities descend on the scene. Here's where things get really strange. The captured airman, calm and polite despite his predicament, insists that he must speak with the Duke of Hamilton, a name that, to British ears, carries the weight of Scottish nobility and high society. Hess claims his mission is vital, and that he knows the Duke personally. The Home Guard, wary but curious, passes this bizarre request up the chain of command. Hess's intended destination was the Duke's grand estate, Dungarville House, nestled in the Scottish countryside. In his mind, the Duke of Hamilton is not just a nobleman, but possibly a secret ally, a member of some clandestine British faction that, if approached correctly, might be open to negotiating peace with Germany. Hess's calculations, however, are fatally flawed. When the authorities reach out, the Duke of Hamilton flatly denies ever having met Hess. Far from being a secret sympathizer, the Duke is actually a loyal British officer, well connected to Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and firmly on the side of the Allies. Whatever rumors Hess had heard about British political intrigue were nothing but wishful thinking or elaborate misinformation. Still, the British government isn't about to pass up the opportunity to interrogate such a high-profile captive. The next day, May 11th, 1941, Hess gets his meeting with the Duke of Hamilton, but it's nothing like the clandestine summit he'd imagined. The Duke listens, perhaps out of curiosity or courtesy, but makes it clear that neither he nor the British government has any interest in striking a separate peace with Germany. Churchill's cabinet is unified. There will be no deal, no compromise with the Nazi regime. Throughout these tense conversations, Hess repeatedly insists that he's acting totally on his own. He denies, again and again, that anyone in the German leadership sent him. He's not an official envoy, not a messenger from Hitler. He's just one man, following his own desperate plan. Whether this was a clever story or a tragic delusion, it seals his fate. Instead of being treated as a diplomat, Hess instantly becomes the most notorious prisoner of war Britain has ever captured. Churchill, never one to miss a trick, is both suspicious and dismissive. Was Hess truly insane, or is this some elaborate Nazi ruse? Either way, Britain moves fast to secure their surprise guest. Hess is shuffled between secure locations, each more secret than the last. For a time, he's even locked away in the Tower of London, a historical footnote that almost sounds like a punchline from The Simpsons. British intelligence interrogates him mercilessly, searching for cracks in his story, probing for the real reason behind this insane flight. But the longer Hess stays in captivity, the more his mental state begins to unravel. The weight of his failed peace mission presses down on him, and within just a few weeks, his mood sours into depression and paranoia. On June 16th, barely 5 weeks after he parachuted into Scotland, Hess tries to end his own life by hurling himself down a staircase. He survives, but the incident sets off alarm bells among his guards. Medical teams and psychiatrists are brought in, and Hess's behavior becomes more erratic, sometimes withdrawn, sometimes delusional, always haunted by the sense that his grand plan has collapsed into disaster. To the outside world, the unwilled Deputy Führer now appears almost pitiful, a man broken by his own ambitions. Churchill himself, reflecting years later, described Hess's flight as a deed of lunatic benevolence. It's a phrase that captures both the madness and the strange idealism behind Hess's actions. Churchill even suggested that Hess's case was more tragic and medical than criminal, as if he'd been overtaken by some private mania rather than deliberate malice. With Hess now in British hands, the German leadership reels from the shock. When Adolf Hitler hears the news that his deputy has flown, unannounced and unsanctioned, into enemy territory, his reaction is volcanic. According to those present at Hitler's headquarters that night, the Führer is first stunned, then erupts into a furious, almost animal outburst. His greatest fear is that Churchill will use Hess's defection to smear Germany's reputation and sow doubt among its allies. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels, ever the master of spin, scrambles to contain the fallout. In his diary, Goebbels records how the German public was suddenly awash with rumors and questions. People openly wondered how someone so unstable could have been second in command. Berlin's official explanation is quick and final. They claim Hess suffered a sudden mental breakdown on the day of his flight, and his actions were the result of insanity. They want everyone to believe that up until the night of the mission, Hess was completely sane. Then, in one fateful moment, everything snapped. Behind closed doors, Hitler is livid. Publicly, he distances himself, declaring that Hess's flight was entirely unauthorized and that he had been betrayed. Privately, his rage is almost palpable. Architect Albert Speer, who was at Hitler's side when the news broke, later described Hitler's outburst as inhuman, a guttural, wordless howl of frustration and disbelief. The fallout is swift and ruthless. Hess is stripped of all official titles and roles. His name is scrubbed from every public record. His duties reassigned to others more trusted. Within weeks, it's as if Hess never existed. Berlin erases him not just from the regime, but from history itself. For Goebbels and the inner circle, the only comfort is that Hess, by this point, was already considered a bit of an oddball, sidelined from the core decisions of the war effort. Still, even among Nazi insiders, theories swirl about what really drove Hess to risk everything. Some believe he was motivated by personal ambition, desperate to secure peace and carve out a legacy as the man who saved Germany from endless war. Others suspect deeper psychological cracks, an unstable mind pushed past its breaking point by the pressures of the world at war. So, what was the truth behind Rudolf Hess's lonely flight across the North Sea? Was he a madman, a rogue peacemaker, or a pawn in a larger, hidden game? The official stories, whether British or German, all seem to raise more questions than they answer. And it's these enduring mysteries that keep the world speculating, even now. As we move forward, keep these questions in mind. Modern historians tend to view Hess's peace mission as a product of desperation and a warped mindset. But as we'll see in the next chapter, the theories, the aftermath, and the enduring mysteries of Hess's mission only get deeper, stranger, and more fascinating from here. By 1941, Rudolf Hess's flight to Scotland was seen as the desperate act of a man who'd lost his way, maybe even his mind. At that point, Hess had slipped from favor in Hitler's inner circle, and his reputation for dabbling in astrology, mysticism, and wild theories was well known among his peers. There's no shortage of stories about Hess poring over star charts, or claiming that dreams guided his decisions. Some say that by 1941, he was clinging to the idea of secret British peace factions, convinced he could single-handedly broker a truce and end the war in Europe. British doctors who examined Hess after he landed described a man who seemed trapped in his own mind, swinging between paranoia, depression, and bouts of manic energy. They noted how he would fixate on strange coincidences or lapse into periods of near catatonic silence. The official story holds that only someone suffering from serious mental strain could dream up a solo peace mission, crossing enemy skies in a Messerschmitt, convinced he could change the course of World War II with a handshake. But as with most mysteries of World War II, the case of Rudolf Hess refuses to fit neatly into a single box. The evidence is murky, the motives are tangled, and every answer seems to spawn another question. Was Hess really a lone madman, acting on delusion? Or was there more going on in the shadows? Something darker, more calculated, and endlessly more intriguing. One theory that's never truly gone away is the idea that Hess didn't act alone. Was Hitler secretly aware of Hess's plan, or even the mastermind behind it? The Nazi regime went out of its way to insist that Hitler was blindsided, and most official accounts agree he was furious when he heard the news. Yet, a few insiders at the time weren't so sure. Some later claimed that Hitler's outrage was pure theater, a carefully staged performance designed to distance himself from a mission gone wrong. And then, decades after the chaos of the Second World War faded, a new twist emerged. In 2011, researchers digging through Russian archives stumbled on a 28-page statement from Karl-Heinz Pinscher, who served as Hess's adjutant. According to this bombshell document, Pinch claimed that Hitler had been prepared for Hess's mission all along. He described a scene in which Hitler received the news with remarkable calm, telling confidants that Hess was acting on his orders to seek peace and economic partnership with Britain before launching Operation Barbarossa against the Soviet Union. If Pincher's account is to be believed, then Hess's flight wasn't a rogue act. It was part of a calculated gamble. The plan, according to this theory, was for Hess to make the first move. If he succeeded in forging an alliance, Hitler could claim credit. If he failed, the Nazi regime could wash its hands of the whole affair declaring Hess mad and denying any involvement. It's a daring scenario, and one that would certainly fit the high-stakes deception of the era. Of course, not everyone buys Pincier's story. For one thing, he gave this testimony while imprisoned, and reportedly under duress by Soviet authorities. The Soviets, eager to sow distrust between Germany and the Western Allies, had every reason to promote the idea of secret Nazi-British negotiations. And when you look at other evidence, things get even murkier. Multiple witnesses remember Hitler being genuinely blindsided and enraged by Hess's disappearance. Not the reaction you'd expect from a man in on the plan. The prevailing consensus among historians is that nobody in Germany's military command authorized Hess's mission, except Hess himself. In fact, there are reports that once Hitler realized what was happening, he ordered the Luftwaffe to intercept and bring down Hess's plane. Whether those orders ever reached the pilots in time, or if they were even real, remains one of those lingering mysteries that keeps researchers up at night. But the intrigue doesn't stop there. Another persistent question. Did British intelligence have a hand in luring Hess across enemy lines? Could MI6 have dangled the promise of sympathetic contacts in Britain, drawing Hess in with carefully crafted bait? Soviet leaders at the time were convinced the British were involved, and Soviet propaganda doubled down on the theory that MI6 had set a trap, perhaps even forging letters in the name of the Duke of Hamilton to coax Hess into making his flight. This idea might sound outlandish, but it could explain why Hess was so certain he had allies waiting for him in Scotland, specifically the Duke. Was he manipulated by British spies? Or was this just another case of a mind unraveling under pressure? So far, no concrete evidence has surfaced to prove British involvement, but the possibility lingers, tantalizing and unresolved. It's also worth considering that the British may have been aware of Hess's growing instability based on intercepted communications or reports from informants. If they saw Hess as a weak link within the Nazi leadership, they might have quietly encouraged his wild ambitions, hoping to destabilize the enemy from within. Yet, for all the speculation, no smoking gun has ever been found in the archives. No intercepted message, no confession from a British officer, no definitive proof that the mission was anything more than a solo gamble. After his ill-fated landing, Rudolf Hess spent the rest of World War II in British custody, isolated from both his homeland and the outside world. In 1945, he was sent back to Germany, where he faced the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg. During the trial, Hess's behavior veered from vacant indifference to sudden, dramatic claims of memory loss. At one point, he insisted he was suffering from amnesia, but the court found him competent enough to stand trial. At least, they decided. Competent at the time his crimes had been committed. Hess was convicted of crimes against peace and sentenced to life imprisonment. For 4 decades, he was the lone occupant of Berlin's Spandau prison, guarded by rotating teams from the American, British, French, and Soviet militaries. He became a living relic of a vanished world, shuffling alone through empty corridors, while the world outside rebuilt itself. In 1987, at the age of 93, Hess died in Spandau under circumstances that remain contested to this day. Officially, it was ruled a suicide, but the rumor mill went into overdrive. Some whispered that he'd been murdered to keep wartime secrets buried forever. Others wondered if Hess himself had orchestrated the final act of a lifelong tragedy. And so the mystery endures. What truly drove Rudolf Hess to risk everything on a lonely flight to Scotland? Was he a deluded idealist, a pawn in an international game, or the secret envoy of a regime that thrived on deception? Maybe some hidden archive still holds the answer. A dusty file, a forgotten letter, or a coded message that could finally reveal the truth behind one of the greatest mysteries of World War II. As we leave the shadowy world of Hess's doomed mission, another enigma from the same era demands our attention. On a cold February afternoon in 1942, thick black smoke billowed over Manhattan's west side as flames devoured one of the world's most magnificent ocean liners. The story of the SS Normandy, later known as the Lafayette, is about to unfold, and it's every bit as dramatic and puzzling as the tale of Rudolf Hess. For miles around, people on the west side of New York looked up to see flames tearing through one of the most spectacular ships ever built. The SS Normandy, crowned jewel of the French merchant fleet, was moored at Pier 88, halfway through an urgent wartime conversion when catastrophe struck. By the time darkness fell on February 9, the Normandy was engulfed in fire. When dawn broke, a majestic hull was half submerged in the Hudson River, listing on her side, gutted and ruined. Was this simply a tragic accident? Did saboteurs sneak into the heart of New York to strike a blow for the Axis? Or, if you believe some of the more colorful theories, did the Mafia stage one of the boldest protection rackets in American history? Today we're going to peel back the layers of this mystery, right down to the smoldering bones of the Normandy herself. Let's rewind a bit and get a sense of just how much was at stake. Designed at the peak of interwar rivalry between Europe's great powers, the Normandy was built in Saint-Nazaire and launched in 1935 with the express goal of smashing every record for speed, size, and luxury. She didn't disappoint. When she took to the Atlantic, she instantly became the world's largest and fastest passenger liner. Everything about the Normandy screamed glamour and national pride. Her interiors were a riot of Art Deco splendor, gleaming glass panels, sweeping staircases, and enough polished brass to blind a sailor at noon. The first-class dining room alone was a cathedral of excess, larger than anything afloat. At full tilt, the ship could carry nearly 2,000 passengers, attended by a crew of over 1,300, who catered to every whim. For a few brief years in the late 1930s, the Normandy was more than a ship. She was a floating palace and a symbol of French ingenuity. Celebrities, industrial titans, and even royalty competed for staterooms. If you wanted to be seen crossing the Atlantic in style, you booked passage on the Normandy. But as with so many icons of the era, her time at the top was painfully short. The world was changing fast. When World War II broke out in September 1939, the Normandy was docked in New York Harbor. That little twist of fate probably saved her from a much worse end on the open ocean. The seas were crawling with German U-boats, and sending her back to France would have been rolling the dice with the national treasure. Instead, the Normandy found herself an unexpected long-term guest in the United States. On September 3rd, 1939, the very day France declared war on Germany, US authorities interned the Normandy, making sure she stayed right where she was and out of reach of Axis powers. For months, the Normandy was basically frozen in time at her Manhattan pier. A French crew remained aboard, keeping up the routines of shipboard life. After May 1940, when France fell to the Nazis, US Coast Guard personnel joined the French to keep watch. The fear was real. Could German agents or collaborators from the Vichy regime try to sabotage the ship? US. Coast Guard logs from 1940 reveal that dozens of guards patrolled the Normandy day and night. They were on the lookout for anything suspicious, loose wires, unaccounted for visitors, or even a whiff of chemical sabotage. Despite the tension, nothing happened. Through 1941, the Normandy sat idle but safe, her French crew keeping her in immaculate condition. They even maintained an elaborate fire watch, just in case. But everything changed after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Suddenly, the United States was at war, and the Normandy, still technically foreign property, became a hot asset. On December 12, 1941, federal authorities did what wartime governments tend to do. They seized the Normandy under the doctrine of angourie, which lets a country appropriate neutral foreign property for war purposes. Just 2 weeks later, she was handed over to the U.S. Navy and rechristened the USS Lafayette in honor of the dashing Marquis, who helped America win its own revolution. Now, just as a quick note for clarity, throughout this story I'll keep calling her the Normandy, even though her official name had changed. It's a small act of rebellion, and trust me, she earned it. The Navy wasted no time. They wanted to turn this luxury liner into a troop ship, capable of ferrying thousands of soldiers across the Atlantic to the war in Europe. The conversion plan was ambitious and, some would say, reckless in its speed. The Normandy's elegant Art Deco fixtures were ripped out in a matter of days to make room for barracks, mess halls, and military gear. Deadlines were tight, corners were cut, and the pressure was on to have the ship ready by mid-February 1942. Hundreds of civilian contractors poured onto the ship, working shoulder to shoulder with Navy personnel. The atmosphere was frantic. Communication was, let's say, less than ideal. And here's where suspicions start to creep in. With so many workers coming and going, how closely were they vetted? Did anyone check for mafia connections or possible Axis sympathizers? Hold that thought, we'll come back to it. Even the Normandy's famed fire protection systems weren't immune to the chaos. Her state-of-the-art sprinklers were partially disabled for the conversion. Worse, the ship's French-sized fire hydrant fittings hadn't yet been adapted for New York's fire department hoses. This is the part where I have to channel my inner Simpsons fan and say, completely unironically, boy, I really hope someone got fired for that blunder. All of this set the stage for disaster. On the afternoon of February 9, 1942, just after 2003 p.m., an acetylene torch flared to life in the Grand Salon, a room that, not long before, had hosted Europe's elite. A welder named Clement Derrick was cutting through a metal stanchion as part of the ongoing demolition. Sparks flew, as they tend to do with acetylene torches. But this time, the sparks landed in a pile of life jackets and burlap sacks that were being stored nearby for removal. In seconds, flames erupted, licking up the walls and across the stacks of flammable material. Panic broke out. Workers grabbed coats, rags, anything they could find, and tried to beat back the flames. But the fire grew too quickly, feeding on all the dry material. The Normandy's fire suppression system was down, leaving just hand extinguishers and hoses. Alarms blared. Within minutes, smoke was pouring out of the upper decks, visible for miles. The New York City Fire Department got the call and barreled down to Pier 88, arriving about 15 minutes later. But by then, the fire was already out of control. Flames had raced up through the lower decks and found plenty of fuel in the ship's ornate woodwork and remaining decor. The freezing winter wind off the Hudson only made things worse, whooping the fire toward the bow. Crowds gathered along the river, watching helplessly as the Normandy's fate was sealed. Even New York's mayor, Fiorello LaGuardia, was swept up in the drama. He was in the middle of a live radio broadcast when he got the news, and he immediately abandoned the studio, racing to the pier to oversee the emergency response. Hours ticked by as firefighters fought a losing battle against the blaze. By early evening, after an exhausting struggle, they finally managed to get the main fire under control. By 6 p.m., most of the flames were out. But the worst was yet to come. In their desperate efforts to save the ship, firefighters had pumped an estimated 6,000 tons of water into the Normandy. It was enough to destabilize her completely. As the night wore on, the Normandy began to list ominously to port. Water sloshed in the lower decks, and no one could pump it out fast enough. Officers tried to counterbalance the ship by flooding compartments on the other side, but nothing worked. Just after midnight, with the list growing worse by the minute, the order came down: abandon the rescue. In the early hours of February 10, 1942, the Normandy rolled over and capsized right at her pier. It took just 12 hours for one of the world's greatest ships to be reduced to a half-sunken, smoldering hulk. And yet, in a twist that almost defies belief, only a single life was lost in the disaster. That one fatality was a civilian shipyard worker on fire watch, tragically trapped by the smoke. About 200 others, firefighters, Coast Guard sailors and workers, were injured or treated for burns and smoke inhalation, but most survived. The world watched in shock as the news spread. In just one day, a symbol of luxury, power, and national pride had been destroyed before America's eyes. Was it truly just a tragic accident, or was there something darker at work behind the flames and chaos? And as the embers cooled, the real intrigue was only just beginning. In the immediate aftermath of the SS Normandy fire in New York Harbor in February 1942, shock rippled through the city and quickly turned into a storm of suspicion. Picture the scene. The world had just been rocked by Pearl Harbor 2 months before, and the United States was newly at war. People were on edge, and in New York, the idea that a ship as magnificent as the Normandy could simply burst into flames by accident didn't sit right with anyone. The city felt like a powder keg, and suddenly everyone had their own theory about what, or who, had really brought down the pride of the French fleet. Rumors moved through the streets like wildfire. Sabotage wasn't just a whispered word. It was shouted in bars, argued about at kitchen tables, and speculated over in newsrooms. Some swore up and down that someone had purposely tampered with the ship's firefighting equipment. Others pointed out the timing, almost too perfect to be a coincidence. With America freshly involved in World War II, could it be that Axis spies were sending a brazen message? These weren't just idle fears either. Just a few weeks earlier, in January, the FBI had busted a massive German espionage ring operating right on American soil. On top of that, German U-boats were lurking offshore, sinking Allied merchant ships so close to the coast that New Yorkers could see the smoke on the horizon. So, when the Normandy, soon to be renamed Lafayette, erupted in flames, plenty of New Yorkers assumed it was the work of enemy agents. And why not? If not Germans, maybe it was Italian saboteurs or homegrown fascist sympathizers lurking among the dock workers. President Franklin D. Roosevelt himself, never one to ignore the pulse of public anxiety, didn't immediately brush aside the sabotage theory. He pressed the Navy Department for answers, pointedly asking if any Axis nationals had been assigned to work on the Normandy's wartime conversion. The investigation quickly became a frenzy. J. Edgar Hoover's FBI agents descended on the wreck like hawks, determined to track down every possible lead. They interviewed witnesses, scoured the twisted remains, and zeroed in on Clement Derrick, the welder whose stray sparks had allegedly started it all. The FBI didn't just take his word. They brought Derrick into a hangar, recreated the exact conditions he'd faced, and handed him the same tools and materials. Under the intense gaze of government officials, Derrick fired up his torch. Just as before, sparks rained down onto burlap-wrapped life jackets, and, almost instantly, the material went up in flames, mirroring the start of the Normandy disaster. That dramatic recreation was a turning point. It gave the official investigation a clear narrative. This was a tragic accident, not a calculated act of war. The evidence began to line up. Both the U.S. Navy inquiry and a congressional investigation dug into the details, tracing the disaster back to a tangle of miscommunications, hasty decisions, and shoddy safety protocols. The consensus began to solidify. The fire was the result of human error, not sabotage. But if you think that's where the story ends, you haven't been paying attention. Even as the Navy and FBI wrapped up their reports, alternative theories refused to die. And one of the most compelling and notorious centers on the New York Mafia. In the dark corners of the city's docks, organized crime figures told a different story about the Normandy's fate. Years after the fire, mobsters started bragging that they, not enemy agents or careless welders, were behind the ship's destruction. According to this underworld version, the infamous Charles Lucky, Luciano, saw opportunity in chaos. In early 1942, Luciano was locked up in a New York prison, but his grip on the city's dock workers' unions hadn't loosened one bit. Mob law claims Luciano hatched a scheme. If the mafia could orchestrate a spectacular act of sabotage, say, setting fire to a high-profile ship, the Navy would have no choice but to come to him for help securing the harbor. In exchange for this assistance, Luciano hoped to bargain his way toward leniency, maybe even freedom. Here's where the plot thickens. The story goes that Anthony Anastasio, a mob boss with iron control over the Brooklyn docks, arranged for arsonists to set the Normandy ablaze, just to prove to the government how vulnerable the port really was. It was the ultimate protection racket, a threat followed by an offer of help. After the disaster, intermediaries connected Luciano to naval intelligence, promising that, for a price, the mafia could guarantee no more sabotage in New York Harbor. At the time, these back-channel deals were buried deep under layers of secrecy. The idea of the US Navy collaborating with gangsters was almost unthinkable, especially during wartime. But the pressure to protect the harbor was enormous, and in March 1942, mere weeks after the Normandy fire, the Office of Naval Intelligence did exactly that. They launched Operation Underworld. Official records, declassified decades later, confirmed it. Naval intelligence officers opened negotiations with Luciano himself. In a move straight out of a gangster film, the mob boss was quietly transferred to a Cushia prison and given permission to communicate with his lieutenants on the outside. The deal was simple. The mafia would help keep the docks safe from enemy agents, and in return, Luciano's sentence was commuted. He was released early and immediately deported to Italy in 1946. His service to the war effort recorded in the most unlikely of places. So, was the mafia really responsible for the Normandy fire? Or did they simply seize the moment, rewriting history to inflate their own legend? No one was ever charged with sabotaging the ship. The official verdict, even after all this time, still classifies the disaster as an accident. Clement Derrick, the welder who started the blaze, was exhaustively investigated, and no links to organized crime ever surfaced. Yet the circumstantial evidence, and the mob's later boasts, continue to fuel speculation. Was the investigation itself compromised, intentionally or otherwise, to protect a secret wartime alliance? One mafia informant, years later, even claimed, "We did the Normandy job." But was that braggadocio, or a rare slip of truth? The facts are slippery, the motives tangled, and the real story may be forever out of reach. Here's what we do know for certain. Operation Underworld was real. In the wake of the Normandy fire, the Navy did make an unprecedented deal with organized crime to secure New York Harbor. The United States government, in its desperation to protect the home front, forged an alliance with gangsters that sounds more like a plot twist from Goodfellas than a chapter in a World War II documentary. In the end, it seems most likely that the mafia simply found itself in the right place at the right time. Controlling the dock workers, they were uniquely positioned to offer the government exactly what it needed: security, loyalty, and a semblance of order on the waterfront. But the mystery lingers, tantalizing as ever. Was the Normandy fire a tragic accident, or the opening move in a devil's bargain between the US government and the underworld? The truth, as with so many mysteries of World War II, remains just out of reach, leaving us to wonder and speculate, and perhaps to never fully know.